Yes, hello everyone, and welcome to the ECPR series on Middle Eastern policy and EU relations. My name is Christos, and I am an assistant professor in European public policy at Pantheon University in Athens. Today's discussion addresses the role of Turkey in the EU's security architecture. And over the past decades, Turkey had a complex relationship with the European Union over the EU's security and defense policy. In this context, and especially after the wars in Ukraine and now in Iran, the question if Turkey fits into the EU's security architecture and how its role is being redefined are very critical and are the main parts of the content of this webinar. More specifically, today's webinar brings together distinguished scholars from Turkey to unpack these dynamics. The first speaker is Senem Aydın Düzgit, a professor of international relations at Sabanci University and director of the Istanbul Policy Center. Among the many positions Senem has held as academic advisor and editor, Professor Düzgit has been a non-resident fellow at the Institute for European Policy Making at Bocconi University and at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin. She has also been a visiting professor at the Harvard Kennedy School. Her research interests include identity, history, and discourse in the study of international politics with an empirical focus on European and Turkish foreign policies. She has published widely in the field of international democracy support, both in the context of European foreign policy through enlargement and Turkish foreign policy. Senem, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. The second speaker is Serhat Güvenç, professor of international relations and dean of the Faculty of Economics, Administrative and Social Sciences at Kadir University, also in beautiful Istanbul. His academic work focuses on Turkish foreign policy, European integration, defense and security studies, as well as military and naval history. Over the course of his career, he has held academic positions at Istanbul Bilgi University and has been a visiting scholar at the University of Chicago. His research and publications cover key issues such as Turkey-EU relations, strategic and maritime security in the Mediterranean and Black Sea, and broader questions of international security. Serhat, it is very nice to see you after our time in IDRA, and welcome to the series. The structure of today's webinar is as follows. Each speaker will have approximately 10-15 minutes to present their insights. Following the individual presentations, we will have a brief 5-minute period for cross-reflection among the speakers, if it is needed, of course. This will allow them to engage with each other's arguments. The webinar will conclude with a question and answer session, which will give to the audience the opportunity to participate in the discussion. A quick note to the audience, please write your questions in the chat box. Senem will focus on how Turkey has contributed to the development of European security architecture historically and how the role of Turkey has changed in the recent years. He will also discuss the exclusion of Turkey from the recent EU defense initiatives such as SAFE, and how this affects the development of a coherent European security architecture. As Serhat will focus more on the bilateral disputes in his presentation of between Turkey and EU member states like Greece and Turkey, and how these disputes shape the participation of Turkey in the EU defense mechanisms and projects. And of course, we cannot leave the elephant in the room, the war in Iran, and how this shapes or reshapes Turkey's strategic importance for the European security, given its geographical position between the Middle East and Europe. Before the speakers, I will now pass the floor to the co-coordinator of the series on Middle Eastern policy and EU relations, my good friend, Dr. Assem, who is Associate Professor at Maastricht University. Assem.
Thanks, Chris. At the moment when Europe's security order is being fundamentally reconfigured, the question of Turkey's role cannot be separated from a more uncomfortable reality, the growing gap between the West's proclaimed commitment to a rules-based international order and its actual strategic behavior. The ongoing Russia-Ukraine war has been framed rightly as a blatant violation of sovereignty and international law. Yet the response to other conflicts, from the genocide in Gaza to recent US and Israeli military actions against Iran, reveals a striking inconsistency in how these very principles are applied. Under the framework of the UN Charter, the use of force is tightly constrained. However, the strikes against Iran, absent clear evidence of imminent self-defense or explicit Security Council authorization, have been widely interpreted as lacking legal justification. The contrast is difficult to ignore. While Russia is condemned and sanctioned for breaching international law, comparable scrutiny is far less forcefully directed at Western or allied uses of force. This selective application of legal norms risks hollowing out the very foundations of the international order that Europe itself claims to defend. For Europe, this is not a distant ethical dilemma. It's a strategic liability. The credibility of its security architecture depends not only on military capabilities or institutional frameworks like NATO, but also on the consistent application of the rules and norms it promotes. When those rules appear contingent, enforced against adversaries but relaxed for allies, the legitimacy of the entire system is called into question. It is precisely within this context that Turkey's evolving role must be understood. Turkey has long occupied a dual position, deeply embedded within Western security structures, yet increasingly assertive in pursuing an autonomous foreign policy. However, the escalation around Iran and the broader perception of Western double standards may accelerate Ankara's drift away from normative alignment with Europe. This shift is further compounded by emerging rhetoric in Israeli political and strategic discourse that frames Turkey not merely as a difficult partner, but as a potential future adversary. Whether such narratives translate into policy or remain rhetorical, they contribute to a deteriorating regional threat environment in which Turkey may begin to see itself through the same lens applied to Iran, as a state subject to pressure, containment, or even preemptive action by Israel and others. From Ankara's perspective, the lesson is clear and deeply consequential. If international law is applied selectively, and if alliance structures do not guarantee protection from coercion, then strategic autonomy becomes not just an option, but maybe a necessity. This might help explain Turkey's diversification of partnerships, its willingness to challenge Western positions, and its increasingly independent security posture. For Europe, this presents a profound contradiction. At a time when geopolitical fragmentation demands cohesion, its own normative inconsistencies risk alienating one of its most important security actors. The question is no longer simply whether Turkey is a partner, a balancer, or a disruptor. Rather, it is whether Europe's security architecture, undermined by its own double standards and the fraction that we see now with the United States, can sustain the trust and alignment of actors like Turkey at all. In this sense, Turkey's trajectory is not just a regional issue. It's a mirror reflecting the broader crisis of credibility at the heart of the Western-led international order, and warning about the consequences of failing to reconcile power with principle. Without further delay, I think we'll give the floor now to Senem to elaborate on all these issues and the complex reality that we are facing, especially now with the war on Iran, unfortunately escalating further and further. So please, the floor is yours, Senem.
Okay. Thank you very much, Assem. It's very nice to see you and all our other friends and colleagues here in today's webinar. Now, I'm going to say a few words first on this history of this very, very briefly, as I've been asked by you coordinators to do that, and also try to reflect on the current situation regarding the EU-Turkey relationship from a more kind of security geopolitical perspective. Now, historically speaking, I think we can kind of wrap up Turkey's historic contributions to the European security architecture under three main headings. I mean, the first one, of course, is the best known one. That is the fact that Turkey has been embedded in Europeans or Europe's security architecture mainly through NATO and its NATO membership. It still, of course, has the second largest army in NATO, spreads over 2% of its GDP on defense, etc. So that is a well-known and often repeated story. Another important contribution, though, has been, of course, through its presence over the Turkish Straits and the Black Sea Order through the Montreux Convention, which, of course, limits naval escalation and has a role in shaping the regional balance. So that can also be considered within the wider European security space. And finally, of course, Turkey has contributed to post-Cold War crisis management in the wider European neighborhood. It has been a well-known active contributor to EU missions, especially in the Balkans, as well as NATO's Balkan operations as well. And as far as I know, it's still present in a number of civilian operations in the Balkans, particularly in Kosovo. So the question is, of course, what has changed? Now, Turkey, of course, is still highly relevant, but I would argue that the political and the institutional terms of that relevance have changed over time. I mean, you had for many years a country whose Western and European vocation was not really contested, right? That is no longer the case. Turkey itself has changed significantly, but the international order within which Turkey operates has also changed tremendously over the past decade or so. If we look at the international order, basically we have a situation, I think, in which we're moving. We have a lot of uncertainty, of course, where we're moving towards. There's a lot of fluidity, but it's definitely, I think it's more or less agreed that we're moving towards some kind of a post-unipolar system of some sort, where middle powers like Turkey feel like their best bet is to hedge their different options and partners and to go for often a self-declared policy of strategic autonomy. This is not unique to Turkey. You see this for multiple middle powers. You have this sort of rhetoric across. But of course, this is a framework, or this is a guiding foreign policy within which you don't identify yourself 100% with one actor, with one institution, with one foreign policy position, but try to hedge and try to balance as much as possible. Now, this has been, I think, the sort of the major change, and still the major change that we're going through, in which, Turkey is trying to position itself in. But also, of course, Turkey's domestic politics, governance, and its ruling elite have also changed tremendously over the last 10 years or 20 years or so. Within which, mistrust and suspicion towards Europe and the West has also increased tremendously, not just in the ruling clique, but also across society. So we do have also a situation in which there is deepening mistrust, not just on the European side that we talk so much about, which I'm going to come back to towards the end, but I would say on the Turkish side as well. So basically, we have a situation in which you have a country that's still deeply embedded in NATO, but its relations with the European Union from a security and defense framework has been corroded to some extent. Now, where do we see that? Well, I mean, if you look at, just the alignment of Turkey's foreign policy positions with the EU foreign policy positions, I think that gives you some idea, where between the years 2006, 2011, you were looking at numbers around, 75% to 90% or so. And now this has been down to at best around 20% of alignment that we're looking at. And there are, of course, this just reflects certain frictions, the Eastern Mediterranean most notably, but also some issues over Russia and elsewhere, and sometimes over Syria as well. So you do have a quite number of issues where the two sides don't exactly reflect the same opinions and foreign policy positions. So today we're looking at a situation in which we're moving, or we have moved, towards a more, from a more integrationist alignment perspective, which was pretty much dominant when Turkey's accession prospect was still on the table as well, to much more selective cooperation amid a high degree of political distrust, I would say, on both sides. Now, of course, at the center of much of that friction lies the presence of Greece and Cyprus, which has to be factored into the equation of this assessment. The bilateral disputes, of course, have always been there, but I would say that they have become particularly corrosive over the past decade or so. So basically, now I think in Europe, what we're seeing is that it's some kind of an institutionalization of the bilateral disputes now inside European security and defense structures, and also the European defense governance that seems to be building up. So now you have a case in which Turkey is seen as a country that's important, yes, but where very selective engagement is preferred, which is largely transactional, very much issue-based, like migration and perhaps to some extent defense industrial cooperation, and more so a country, where close relations, if ever, are developed at the more bilateral level between specific EU member states and Turkey rather than at the wider European level. And this is where, of course, the SAFE controversy, which also you asked me to elaborate a little bit more on at the beginning, comes into the picture because, of course, we know that the SAFE initiative is, of course, open to candidates, but, there are conditions attached to it. It is conditional. And, of course, it's politically mediated. It's subject to political mediation between the EU member states. And this, of course, leads, at least for now, to the exclusion of Turkey from this initiative. And also it's, sets a example of where Turkey might stand in case there will be similar initiatives or integrationist, policies that emerge in this field. This exclusion, of course, has certain repercussions, like for Europe. It means that, that there's ultimately going to be a mismatch between Europe's threat map and its actually institutional map that it's emerging through these SAFE initiatives in the case that they continue excluding Turkey. It also runs the risk of deepening this awkward divide between NATO-centered defense and EU-centered defense and industrial initiatives, which of course risks further fragmentation and, also risks the chance of this broader, ecosystem for armament and rearmament. So that's, those are the arguments that can be made for the potential repercussions of Turkey's exclusion from the SAFE initiative. But having said all that, we also have to look at the other side of the coin and look at why it's being excluded, despite some of the rational reasons for, why it should be in. Of course, there are issues regarding trust. There are issues regarding foreign policy alignment due to the multiple reasons that have to do with the international order, foreign policy priorities, etc. that exist out there. And of course, the issue of political values. Now, this creates, and when I talk about the political values, I'm, talking about the current state of democratic deterioration and significant backsliding. And I don't think backsliding does sufficient justice to the situation that Turkey is in, which is on the way to increasing slide towards authoritarianism. Now, in this kind of situation, of course, it becomes very difficult or at least it becomes much more easier, I would say, for the positions of Greece and Cyprus and often the French as well to kind of hijack the entire European agenda when it comes to the security discussion. Because once trust runs low and once you don't have that political will to engage, then it becomes much more easy to veto or block certain foreign policy initiatives that might be exclusionary. And I think this is an important point to keep in mind, whether or not and that is, I think, the major dilemma that Europe has to go through, is whether or not you can somehow overcome this trust issue and somehow at least balance foreign policy priorities across the member states and find a way to engage more closely when there is a need to do so. So I think I'm just going to stop it at that and hopefully be able to respond to your questions and comments that might follow from this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, go ahead.
Please, Serhat, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Assem and Christos. Thanks for the invitation. These are interesting times, as it has always been for us, those who live and work in Turkey and try to make sense of Turkey-EU relations. When you were, sharing my biography, I realized that I no longer study or teach European integration. I gave up on that issue a long time ago, indeed. But European security remains one of my research areas, and it has become more relevant recently. Senem Hoca set the framework very much and covered some of the things I was planning to cover, especially in the context of SAFE. SAFE is a good example of, how restrictive the EU is for Turkish participation, to put differently, for a number of reasons. Turkey is a candidate country, but it is technically eligible, but it cannot enjoy access to the funds under SAFE because of the bilateral disputes with Greece and the Cyprus problem. But on the other hand, Turkey has a highly developed defense industry, which produces hardware and software to NATO standards. So interoperability is not a problem. So any EU country, of which, with the exception of 3, are all NATO members, that means they also adhere to NATO's interoperability standards. So you have a supplier, potential supplier, which produces highly competitive, high-tech products, right, which are compatible with an existing standards of the only surviving military alliance in the world. Yet there is no place for this producer in the EU's effort to ramp up its defense production. Well, why? I think Senem Hoca, France has moderated its opposition to Turkey's inclusion in European security structures and institutions. Compared to past, I guess, they have turned more accommodating, maybe not within the EU framework, but definitely the German and French positions are somewhat aligned as regards to the need to bring Turkey into the fold in one way or another. But they have not come up with an institutional formula that would make this possible. And obviously, bilateral disputes have an impact on Turkey's participation into the EU defense mechanisms and projects. And this was the topic of our grant project, indeed, 2 years ago. 3 colleagues of mine and I conducted a project funded by CATS to explore the prospects for defense industries' potential role as a bridge, or to build rebuilding bridges between Turkey and the European Union. And our answer was that there is potential, but it will never be taken advantage of. I mean, there was no way under the existing decision-making architecture and practices of the European Union, this will not happen. Defense industrial cooperation and institutional cooperation is out of question. And under the existing institutional arrangements, there is no way to go around that. This was our conclusion after 2 years of work on this project. There is a need for, bringing Turkish and European capabilities together, but despite that need, there are 2 impediments which I already covered. The disputes and their impact on the EU decision-making, especially as regards to SAFE, and the other issue which Senem Hoca already brought up, Turkey's democratic backsliding, deterioration, or Turkey's move towards authoritarianism. Without Turkey bringing its domestic order somewhat aligned with European standards. I'm not talking about Copenhagen criteria, but acceptable, bringing Turkey back to tolerable democratic standards will probably help EU or those advocates in the European Union of a closer defense cooperation between Turkey and the European Union. But as these 2 impediments stand, and they seem to be here to stay, unfortunately, in the foreseeable future, we see examples of practical and bilateral cooperation in the field of defense and defense industry. There are several cases, and these are projects of cooperation between Turkish companies and the EU companies, mostly in the form of either launching new defense companies in an EU country, as is the case of Otokar, building a factory, a plant for armored vehicle production in Romania. Also, Turkey's sale of an ocean-going petrol ship to Romania. Also, Turkey's building of two replenishment or supply vessels to Portugal. Also, sale of Hürjet to Spain, and indeed, this is an interesting case of cooperation. Airbus is involved. It will be promoting Hürjet across Europe and around the world. And of course, the most striking example is Baykar's takeover of Piaggio in Italy. So some Turkish companies have already found ways around the EU's institutional mechanisms to start or to have a presence in the European Union defense industry. But again, I mean, this is not a substitute for an institutionalized cooperation. But nevertheless, I mean, on both sides, there are attempts to go around those impediments and materialize cooperation, which will be beneficial for all sides involved. I mean, it will contribute to the overall security of the European Union. It will help those EU members to improve their defense capabilities, and it will help Turkish companies to have access to the European Union's defense markets. When we first picked up European security, I think it was in 1999, during the same summit where Turkey was declared a candidate, the European Union for the first time came up with this ESDP idea. And back then, I mean, there was a discussion mirroring, the different approaches to security on both sides of the debate. For the Europeans, Turkey was a security consumer, whereas the Turks bragged about being a security provider, for Europe. There was no agreement. I mean, the positions were worlds apart. But I think, I mean, the realities on the ground, I guess, kind of narrowed that gap in understanding or in making sense of Turkey's role in the European security. Again, 2 or 3 weeks ago, NATO conducted its largest exercise of the year, right? Operation Steadfast Dart. Because United States, which normally brings in, the most usually is the largest contributor to such exercises, was absent. And Turkey tried to fill in the shoes of the United States. What we saw was a Turkish successful projection of power from Turkey all the way to Baltic, by air and by sea. And I mean, they figured Turkish contingent figured very prominently. I mean, this is not only a telltale sign of a potential role Turkey may play in European security, especially in the absence of United States, but also I think it's a very deliberate sign of change of axis on the part of Ankara. Because before pandemics, NATO held Baltops exercises in the Baltic Sea, and the biggest contribution Turkey made to those exercises was earmarking a frigate, right? But Baltops was Vladimir Putin didn't like Baltops exercises. He even asked Trump to stop conducting such exercises in the Baltics. Now, Turkish presence in the Baltics, increased from one frigate to a major naval task force built around a big amphibious ship. This shows that Turkey, or at least Ankara or Erdogan, no longer considers Russia in, kind of in deciding what role Turkey will play or which exercises Turkey will participate and with what kind of force structure. Therefore, I think that exercise and Turkish contribution to it mark the end of the debate on Turkey's shift of axis. Obviously, Turkey prefers to play a role in the European security, or Turkey obviously is looking for a role in European security. So whether this will come to the exclusion of Middle East as a security priority in Turkish calculations, another question. But obviously, the focus has been shifting a bit away from the Middle East and to Europe again. As for the war's impact on Turkey's strategic importance, well, I would assume we would be talking about the war in Ukraine, but now we have the war in Iran, and that has changed everything. You know, that has redefined everything, and it's about to redefine the regional geopolitics. It's a reminder of Turkey's real estate value for the Western security. Again, the case in point is that X-band radar, which operates as part of NATO's ballistic missile defense system in Malatya Kürecik. United States and some Gulf countries had very sophisticated anti-ballistic missile radars in the Middle East, especially in the Gulf, but Iran very successfully took those radars out. So there is two sophisticated systems left. One is in Israel, in Negev, which is a US base, and the other one is in Malatya. And of course, there are US Navy destroyers in the Eastern Mediterranean, which are also feeding into this anti-ballistic missile defense network of NATO. The problem for Europe will be, Iran launched, at least that is the official explanation. Iran launched 3 ballistic missiles at Turkey, and 3 of them were intercepted. But if Iran succeeds in taking out that TB2 X-band radar in Turkey, then Europe's ballistic missile defense will begin from Romania. This will reduce the identification and response time, increase identification and response time immensely. So, from this perspective as well, Europe has a vested interest in keeping Turkey on its side in order to maintain that, response time in case of ballistic missile threats from the Middle East. And I will conclude with the importance of having integrated ballistic missile defense system. The war in Iran, or between Iran, Israel, and the United States, showed once again that, standing alone is not an option in case of ballistic missile defense systems. You have to have fully integrated systems. And therefore, I think, both sides, both Turkey and European Union, probably will give priority to developing capabilities to improve their ballistic missile defense systems. 2 years ago, I think the previous German chancellor indeed brought both Turkey and Greece into this European Sky initiative, if you remember. So it was a good beginning, but I guess that project did not make much of a progress. And we see Greece is investing in such capabilities on its own, but not against threats from the Middle East, unfortunately against Turkey. So here we see the impact of bilateral disputes, even when the threat environment requires focus on threats at a level much beyond the bilateral indeed disputes or bilateral competition between the two countries. I guess a new world order will emerge. We are in transition from one order to another, but we are in a state of influx. And even the war in the Middle East obviously has not caused much of a rethinking, especially in Greece and Cyprus, regarding the future of European security with or without Turkey. I guess my reading of the situation is that from Athens and Nicosia, or the western part of Nicosia, I guess this is yet another opportunity to promote their national interests against Turkey. And therefore, we need a new thinking and we need a new security paradigm so that, the potential, the cooperation potential could be tapped better. And I should stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Serhat, for these interesting and comprehensive insights. I don't know if Senem, you want to comment or add something to what Serhat has mentioned, or Serhat, do you want to address anything, any points that Senem has raised earlier?
Both speakers seem fine with the presentation. Good. We have already some questions, but if I can use my privilege as a coordinator here, as a co-coordinator, I have a question for Senem and Serhat. Here in Greece, there are two issues that are very important in this bilateral security-related architecture and relationship between Greece and Turkey. The first is if Turkey can have access to these financial instruments such as SAFE through the back door. Serhat answered this question, because by current Turkish companies can purchase Italian companies. So if an Italian company can access the SAFE instrument, which is, the Italian company is owned, basically is in Turkish hands. So I suppose this is a way that this back door can open for Turkish companies. But after the war in Iran, a question or some sort of concern is if this will lead to the further militarization in Cyprus. Greece has sent the military to defend the Greek side of the island. Turkey has done the same. Both administrations have been quite reasonable. They didn't, raise the flag too much, to create another headache in a region which already suffers from the war. But do we see this being a step towards a further militarization of the island? Yeah, Senem or Serhat, yeah.
Shall I go first? Or Senem, would you like
I
to?
think Serhat Hoca would be better positioned to respond to this, but I can continue after him. Yeah.
Yeah, Christos, you're right. I mean, both sides' responses to the deployment of additional military assets or foreign military assets in the island has been very muted indeed. I mean, yes, we heard the usual statements were made, the positions were reiterated, etc. But of course, deep down, they realized that, to tackle the threat, they need whatever assets the EU members, NATO members could deploy on the island. So that is one side of the story. But I see a problem. I mean, unless they have built, an ad hoc mechanism for coordination and communication, you need to have kind of a layered, structured response in case of a threat. Now, you have Turkish military assets. You have a Dutch frigate. You have an Italian frigate. You have a French naval task force. And you have two Greek or Hellenic Navy frigates. So who is going to be the first responder? Do we know that? You have to, in an air defense system, you have to have an integrated, network-centric defense architecture. What we have is, kind of bits and pieces, under national commands. And who is, who is putting together the recognized maritime picture, or who is putting together the recognized air picture around the island, because those are essential for early warning and response. So who is in charge? Who is in command? Who is going to, do what in case of what? We don't know that. But when you have, such assets in place, of course, they have practiced, this under the NATO framework for years. So probably there is an ad hoc mechanism coordinating the responses. As for militarization of the island, well, the island has been heavily militarized. Armed to the teeth, both sides, right? So there is this law of diminishing returns. What can you achieve with that? If the air defense system, Greek Cypriot administration bought from Israel was good enough, then they would not need those assets, right? So it's not sufficient, obviously. And Turkey, for its part, had introduced, air defense systems, Korkut and Hisar air systems back in January, indeed. But now, back then, the Greek Cypriots protested their deployment, but now, they are useful assets because, they will provide some sort of an additional layer of defense. But I don't see prospects for further militarization, but there is an urgent need to rethink the security needs of the island as a whole. A new paradigm is needed. We should not, I don't think we will see a stable Middle East in the foreseeable future. And the current war showed us that Cyprus, unfortunately, is part of Middle Eastern geopolitics. It may be an EU member, but this has not necessarily resulted the geographical decoupling of the island from the regional geopolitics. But it will take courage. It will take innovative, creative thinking, and giving up on past beliefs and giving up on positions both sides had entrenched themselves for decades. But this is a world in transition, so anything may come out of this. Because the threat is totally different, and it's very serious.
Thank you very much, Serhat. Senem, I don't know if you want to follow up.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And also there's a question there in the chat that kind of relates to your comment about whether Turkey would withdraw troops from Cyprus. As things stand, I don't think that should be a realistic expectation or possibility. Especially now with the Iran war, I think that should not be expected unless there is some kind of as Serhat was saying, a paradigm shift and a more comprehensive security settlement is reached on the island. I don't see that as a realistic possibility.
Since you mentioned the war in Iran, there's also a question related to the tolerating authoritarianism and geopolitical consideration. Will the war in Iran lead to more?
Yeah. I could respond to that. I've seen Amy Verdon's question on that. I don't think EU really has so much problem with tolerating authoritarianism as long as it can tolerate authoritarianism, in other words, if it perceives an existential threat to its own European order, most specifically, the country's domestic orders, which might require working with Turkey. And I think migration is an excellent example to demonstrate that. And that relates to another question there as well, whether or not there is cooperation. Yes, of course, cooperation continues in migration is one of those areas where there is still successful cooperation. If you look at it from the perspective of numbers and who's going in and who's going out. And on Iran as well, I think that was very clear because von der Leyen, she was, tweeting a number of things about, the leaders she was talking to and the issues that she was talking about after the war broke out. And when she mentioned that she spoke to Erdogan, her tweet was all about migration, that they talked about a potential migration risk and that Erdogan was willing to work with her. So that is the EU's, at least from the Commission's, I would say, perspective of where Turkey stands or where the priority with Turkey stands when it comes to the war in Iran, right? migration. So, you know, since they perceive it as such, and their authoritarianism is fine, right? Because that is the existential threat issue. And unless there is something of a similar value to European, or as I said, domestic national orders perceived as existential as migration, I don't think that you know, they would have to face that huge trade-off. Whereas much easier to talk about democracy and human rights, etc., when there are already, you know, other thorny issues or obstacles within the EU that prevents closer cooperation with Turkey, like issues with Greece, like issues with Cyprus, and sometimes issues with France, which are, to my extent, I agree that, you know, issues with France have also been less frictional recently. But yeah. So that would be my response to that question, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Senem. There's a question in the Q&A for Serhat. Given, I don't know if you saw it, given the pivotal legacy of Turkey's decades-old membership to NATO, there appears a general feeling of resentment in the Turkish community that the EU has not so far reciprocated fairly. So far, the questions of Ankara's EU bid. And given the context that strategically, Turkey holds a key role with regards to the European security landscape, what is the predictable future of Turkey-EU security relations?
I see no role for Turkey in the EU security. Under the existing, you know, setup, there is no room for accommodating Turkey in one way or another. Let me be blunt. And EU is not much of an issue lately, right, in Turkey. Am I wrong? I mean, there is, you know, I mean, NATO membership, you know, this revival of NATO's relevance after Russian war of aggression in Ukraine, you know, I think made most Turks content with NATO membership. And, you know, Turkey kind of reaped the benefits of being a long-time membership by blocking Finnish and Swedish entries. So it proved that it was an important member which held and exercised veto power. And back then, it seemed that, you know, NATO would remain the core security institution of Europe, regardless of what the European Union is contemplating to do. But now we have a different situation. You know, if United States substantially reduces its commitments to NATO, or even goes so far as to withdraw from NATO altogether, and it will be a totally different situation. You know, the comfort that NATO membership has been giving Turkey will dissipate. Then there will be a greater need for finding a way to incorporate Turkey into European security, not EU security. EU is a different issue, I mean, and it's not on the table. But security, European security, is also Turkey's problem without United States as a member of NATO, or without United States, you know, with reduced commitments to European security, then Turkey has a problem. Therefore, I mean, this eventuality may force Turkey to rethink, you know, its EU membership, its relations with the European Union as a whole. You know, the authoritarian tendencies may need to be reconsidered, etc. Because we have an overarching security situation. Russian threat in the north, in the south, Israeli threat. By the way, I mean, although Iran launched 3 ballistic missiles on Turkey, public opinion and decision makers view Israel as a greater threat than Iran. Therefore, I'm not very optimistic about the future, but as long as existing mechanisms, existing architecture remain in place, Turkey will continue to feel secure. But Trump, working with Trump or working with the United States, so far, probably, I mean, in Erdogan's thinking, seemed a more rewarding option indeed. And he reaped the benefits of, working with Trump. So the question for Europe then, I mean, are they ready to lose Turkey to the United States? Because in one of the questions, there was the assumption of convergence between the European Union and the American security interests and policies. I don't think that's the case anymore. There is no West as we know it, right? So Erdogan may decide to throw his lot with Donald Trump's United States, and which seems to realize that it may need Turkey's bases in Turkey for its military entanglements in the Middle East. I mean, there is a rumor that Washington already knocked on Turkey's door for access to air bases in Turkey, at least for tanker aircraft. So if United States rediscovers Turkey's real estate value, and if we see, the positive impact of this rediscovery on the bilateral relations, then, and it has always been the case for Ankara, I mean, Turkey has been an Atlanticist member of NATO, so Washington may seem a more appealing option for Turkey, because Washington, does not ask questions about democracy, does not care about human rights. It's all, pragmatic cooperation and transactionalism, and which may serve Erdogan's political agenda, both at home and abroad, better than, having a renewed relationship with the European Union or redefined, relationship with the European Union.
Thank you very much, Serhat. There is another question by Leonardo about the compatibility of the Turkish approach towards the MENA, Middle East and North Africa, for example, in Libya, I suppose, and the European approach, especially by Italy and France, again in Libya. As a case study, I try to read between the lines of Leonardo's comment. And the question is if Turkey is integrated in the EU security, if this will exacerbate the existing differences and conflict between these countries. The two actors pursue different approaches in the MENA. So I don't know if Senem or can answer this question.
Yeah, I mean, I can have a first go, and then maybe Serhat or you might want to add. I think those frictions were more pronounced, let's say, 3-4 years ago, than they are today. So it seems to be that we're and the bilateral relationship between Italy and Turkey are pretty solid, extending into industrial cooperation as well. So I would put that aside. I mean, it's one of those countries where in the EU that Turkey currently has probably the best relations with. But with France as well, I would say less contested than it was during the high peak of the Libyan civil war. I don't think so. So I don't think much of a issue at the moment with that. So I agree with Serhat on that. On the Russia question as well, I mean, I think Turkey's position has been shifting, particularly after what happened in Syria, where Russia is no longer a competitive force in Syria for Turkey. And then what played out in Nagorno-Karabakh also, that really strengthened Turkey's hand. So Turkey is now, I think, in a position where you can see that also in its effort to diversify energy sources besides Russia. So now I think it's trying to minimize that dependence as well. It's very difficult to do, but the recent LNG deals with the United States, etc., I think that should also be read in that larger perspective. So I would say there is a gradual shift there about, Turkey feeling a bit more confident, I think, with respect to Russia compared to, let's say, the first years of the war or just before that. So that also needs to be said. And a question that, again, connects to these, and I've also seen it on the chat, about Turkey, going out alone and, pursuing a very different policy than the West. But I mean, that assumes that there is a unified Western position on the major geopolitical issues of today, and I don't think there is. If you look at where the United States stands, for instance, on many issues, with Iran, for instance, where it stands, and there are divisions within the EU member states, right? Some are more explicitly opposed, some are not because of obvious reasons, right? So I don't think there is a very clear Western position. And I agree with Serhat, Güvenç, in the sense that Turkey is pretty much aligned with Trump. when it comes to foreign policy issues. So if you take Trump as a Western kind of security sort of reference point, then I don't think there is a problem there, because I mean, on the Iranian question, of course, Turkey seems to be more in the middle, or it's trying to at least stay out of it for now. We'll see how far it will be able to hold this position, if ever. But in Syria, for instance, they're perfectly aligned. All that competition between Israel and Turkey in the Middle East is managed by Trump, who's kind of the middleman in this, managing both two sides. Turkey in the Gaza for Peace plan, which is a joke, but still it's in it, right? So you see that there is not that much this, misalignment that's going on. And as long as Europe follows or pursues the Trump path, I don't see where there's going to be a major friction here. So yeah, that's just something I wanted to point out, because I think that's an important point.
I would like to add two things. The first, the questions, imply that there is an overarching EU strategy, and with which Turkey does not agree. That's not the case. We're talking about individual EU members' strategic objectives here and there. There is no such thing. There is this unity of strategic objectives, I guess, is a fallacy. So Turkey has problems with individual EU member states in different parts of the world, but not necessarily at odds with the overall EU strategic framework. Let's put it this way. Secondly, and another misperception or misplaced assumption, I would say, without credible prospects for Turkey EU membership, there is no room for conditionality. Withdrawing Turkish troops from Cyprus, aligning with EU positions. No, that's not the case. If the membership is not on the table, it's a level field. That is what I was that was the point I was trying to make. We have to change the way we conceive, we think Turkish-EU relations. There is no membership at the end of the day, even if Turkey and EU, comes up with a deal on, security. It's going to be a different arrangement. So the EU is not in a position to, make the decisions and expect Turkey to follow. No. There needs to be a compromise, of course, reflecting the relative power and strength of the two parties, but it's more or less a level field. There is no room for lecturing or conditionality. Let's face it.
Can I add something to that? Because I'm just going to follow from here. There is also not if you look at it from a purely security defense architecture point of view, you don't have that in Europe. You have SAFE, you have certain initiatives to boost European industrial capacity, but do we see a Europe that's going to have its own sort of security architecture, boots on the ground, etc., without the US and NATO plug-in in the foreseeable future? Even if they put their minds to it, it will probably be at least a decade or so for Europe to develop that kind of capability. So that is why, and that sort of, here I'm going to plug into one of the initial questions that were asked, that Turkey is not bothered about this so much. So Turkey, there's not really much of a question or discussion in Turkey about, oh my God, we're sort of being excluded. Turkey talks about the EU these days, and it's bothered about trade issues. It's bothered about the potential risk of remaining outside the Made in Europe initiatives because Turkey trades so heavily with the EU. And there, of course, there can be huge losses on Turkey's part if it's excluded. And because these issues are also issues where Europe can benefit a lot from, right? Given the current trade fragmentation and the European pursuit of enlarging its sort of free trade areas, etc. There they are having the conversation, and it's much easier than the security conversation because both sides' stars are aligned on that front. So I think it's an important example to show how you can have these different debates and concerns. And on the security front, Turkey does not seem to share that kind of existential anxiety, precisely because I think they also think that NATO here will be the main reference point when it comes to hardcore defense issues, at least for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, thank you very much, Senem. Serhat, about this reverse of the flipping the coin, regarding the negotiations between Turkey and the EU. There are a couple of comments here, about the contradictions of talking about the participation of Turkey in the EU security architecture, given that, there is this problem with the occupation of North Cyprus. There are fears, especially in Greece, that by flipping the coin, the European Union will force the Greek side of Cyprus to compromise much. What is the response, or what is the debate in Turkey about this?
You mean need to compromise in case Turkey and EU works out a deal on security?
Yeah.
That is pretty much the conclusion, from most experts, arrive at. That's not the perception in the public, but, the rhetoric is that Athens and Nicosia have taken advantage of the situation to increase their military footprint on the island. Okay, and of course, a typical security dilemma. Therefore, Turkey should deploy additional forces on the island. There is a grain of truth in that thinking. If Turkey is regarded eventually an acceptable and important provider of security for Europe, then there's gotta be some compromises. Between Turkey and Greece, and between Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots. As for the Turkish troops, again, the security, may I remind you that in 2004, if Annan Plan had not been voted down, there would have been only 650 Turkish troops on the island. So back then, Turkey was ready, more than ready to compromise. So were the Turkish Cypriots. And therefore, there was a chance, unfortunately, that was missed, wasted terribly by the Greek Cypriots. Therefore, let's set the record straight in that regard. And I was for, back then, withdrawal of the Turkish troops from the island under the modality of the Annan Plan. But that's a different ballgame now. Is Cyprus now more secure or less secure vis-a-vis the threat from Iran and Hezbollah, with or without Turkish military assets on the island?
Thank you so much. I think you've probably answered.
There was
all
a
the
question
questions.
about Israel, siding with Israel, European Union.
Yes, the last
That's
one.
a very good question. That's a very good thought-provoking question. Such siding with Israel against Turkey would probably be the final nail on the coffin of the European Union as the last standing defender of, rules-based international order. Who would want to side with Israel for realpolitik concerns? I would strongly advise against it. For anyone, if there is a West, if there are values which we adhere to, which we support, which we champion, Israel is not the right partner for anyone who has something to do with democracy, human rights, rules-based international order. Thank you.
Something related prior to the attack on Iran, there were a lot of talks about sort of an alignment between Turkey, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, some sort of security or defense, something like that. And Israel has been very critical of that over this, and now they threaten once we're done with the Shiite terrorism, we'll move to the Sunni terrorism. Like, where does this fit in? If this goes forward after the war ends with Iran, how does it fit also in the European security order, if it moves forward, or the regional security?
Well, I mean, I'll try to have a go at this one, but I'll have to speculate a lot because, as I said at the beginning, it's all fluid and moving in all sorts of directions. It's very hard to tell. Now, I know that we've all been hearing, at least in Turkey here, we've been quite attentive to that. All these talks about, from, Israelis and officials, former officials, that Turkey will be next and they're kind of this and that, whatever. I think much of it has to do with the fact that Israel and the current regime in Israel needs an enemy to sustain itself, and it feeds on conflict. So there's definitely a domestic part of the story that we should not ignore. But also, I think, at least for the present, it is not a realistic possibility to see some kind of military escalation regarding these two countries, as I don't think the United States would allow it. So it's, for now, I mean, even in Syria, where the two sides have been competing against one another, since the fall of Assad, there seems to be some kind of a tacit agreement now where Turkey is more present in the north and Israel in the south. So you see that there is a kind of a division of sort of geographical labor there that, under the, of course, umbrella of the Americans and how they're kind of mediating. So I don't see that happening in the foreseeable, at least for the near future, let's say. Again, speculating, you never know. But in the long run, I don't think we can completely eradicate the possibility of that in the very long run, after or if Iran falls, or what kind of Iran we're going to see. I mean, again, we don't know. We don't even know how far this war will continue or what it's going to result in. We don't also know whether or not, there will be a change of government in the United States that's going to see this all in a different light. We know that public opinion has been shifting in the United States, increasingly towards an anti-Israeli position, especially among the Republicans as well. And so things might change there. So it's very difficult to tell for now. But in the long run, there is a risk, even though it might not be too high, that this two sides might not see, they might, find themselves in a sort of head-on confrontation position. But for now, I don't think that's realistic to expect that. But again, I wonder what Serhat thinks, because this is my view of it, but it's, again, very speculative.
Well, there is a school of thought which believes that the anti-Israeli rhetoric in Turkey and anti-Turkey rhetoric in Israel are for domestic audiences. I'm kind of closer to that school of thought, because, I mean, it's not inconceivable, but, first and foremost, Israel has to take care of the business of Iran. And it seems that it's going to take long, and it will exhaust Israel. So to have a direct confrontation with Turkey, Israel will need some time to recover from its wounds. And probably, I mean, it will continue to have wounds inflicted on it as long as this conflict goes on. As for this constellation of Turkey, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, and at one point, Azerbaijan was also in that picture. So, but it's no longer it's no longer regarded as one of the potential members of the grouping, because of its pro-Israeli, I mean, overt pro-Israeli leanings. The case of Saudi Arabia, I can make sense. I mean, they have motives for furthering, engaging each other and furthering, especially military cooperation with each other. Saudi Arabia has the money. Turkey has the defense industry and projects. And Saudi Arabia wants to reduce its dependence on the United States. So Turkey may offer, not it does not offer an alternative, but may offer a viable alternative as a supplier of arms to Saudi Arabia. The case of Pakistan is different. I mean, the Saudi-Pakistani relations, they have, they have been close for a long time. But what makes Pakistan a crucial partner for Turkey is that it's a nuclear country. It has nuclear weapons. If United States, withdraws its commitments, including nuclear deterrence over NATO members, France seems to be ready to step in to fill that nuclear deterrence vacuum in case of US withdrawal. Where would Turkey turn to? So I think what makes Pakistan an attractive option for Turkey, I mean, regardless of this historical ties between the two countries, brotherly nations, etc., Pakistan has the nuclear technology. It's a nuclear weapon country. And therefore, it may help Turkey one day. I hope that day never comes. If, Turkey needs to find an alternative extended deterrence provider. I think basically, I mean, again, these are all speculations. But Azerbaijan, Pakistan, and Turkey have cooperated in the field of defense industry. For instance, Azerbaijan bought Pakistani-produced JF-16 fighter jets, and Pakistan uses Aselsan-produced targeting pods, etc. So a Pakistani system could incorporate Turkish system. These are indeed, I think, precursors to a more extensive Turkish-Pakistani defense cooperation in case Turkey does not find alternatives, i.e. European Union or Europe.
Serhat and Senem, there is a question about, it's a hypothetical question about, the commitment of Erdogan to Annan's plan, if that was the case, because you talked about the withdrawal of the Turkish troops. Of course, it's a hypothetical question, right? So, it's very difficult to answer it, but there is a question from the audience. And I have also one small question. Maybe the answer is too long, so, forgive me about this at the end of the event. You focus very much on the EU security architecture and the role of Turkey, and you mentioned very much the institutional problems and the veto of Greece and Cyprus. How does the balance between cooperation between Turkish industry, the Turkish military industry, and the autonomy that Turkey sought or seeks affects the participation of Turkey in the EU security architecture?
I don't buy this strategic autonomy argument. Sorry.
Okay.
Senem
sorry, Serhat Hocam, go ahead.
I don't buy this strategic autonomy argument. I mean, Turkey is a middle power, as Senem Hoca put it. So it has its limits. I mean, take the case of France, a champion of strategic. Is France strategically autonomous? I mean, that will be the extent of Turkish strategic autonomy eventually. I mean, that's my thinking. As for the Annan plan question, well, I don't deal with counterfactuals or what-if questions. I mean, I would accept such a questioning if the plan had gone through and Erdogan, did not deliver on his promises. Then that would have been a legitimate question. But it's not that. I mean, we're not there.
Thank you very much,
And we like counterfactuals on this part of the world. Yeah. I mean, it's way back. It was 20-some years ago. It didn't happen. So no need to deal with those.
Yeah.
I mean, that's my perspective. Not that I shy away from debating, but it will be a futile exercise.
Yeah, it's very hypothetical. Yeah, it can go either way. You're right. Senem?
I can make an attempt at that hypothetical. It's possible though, right? Because in the case, since we're of the age that we have actually experienced that period firsthand, and we know the international order more or less at the time, and Turkey's relations with Europe and how it was framed mostly from an accession perspective, and the mood was high, especially in Turkey. I think if Annan Plan had gone through, a very major friction between the EU-Turkey relationship could actually cease to exist, which is relations with Cyprus and Greece. And again, hypothetical, we don't know. But it could have, because if you look at where Turkey's relations with the EU turned sour, it's mostly after 2006 with the December summit, which took the decision that, well, because of this customs union extension to Cyprus, we're not going to close any negotiation chapters and this and that. So I think that was the time, and a little bit after that, when the Turkish government felt like, there is no credibility of this accession perspective. It's going to be politically too costly. It's going to be too long, and it's not going to work out. There's always going to be these vetoes. So, and then, you had the Arab Spring and other things, and then things changed, right? And then the two sides started diverging. And after 2013, and also, particularly with the migration agreement, now we had a completely different set of relationship, which was going to be totally outside the accession framework, strictly transactional, based on certain policy issues of existential concern for Europe. That's it. So because of, that trajectory, perhaps could have been delayed, or maybe it would still have happened. I don't know, right? But maybe there's also a counterfactual alternative world where, Turkey's relationship with EU, perhaps, maybe those accession chapters could be closed. Maybe in Turkey, you would see a different set of affairs, and then perhaps a much different kind of relationship that is not so much based on mistrust, and also not, on the existence of veto players, because it would have been a more kind of inclusive framework. I don't know, but again, I think I still believe that it was a strategic mistake on the part of the Greek Cypriots to reject the Annan Plan, because I also think that time is not on the side of Cyprus when you think about long term, about Turkey's demography, the changing geopolitics, and all of this. I think it would have been much safer for Cyprus if that agreement had been reached. That's another counterfactual that I'd like people to think about a little bit.
Thank you so much.